literally wasting time, anesthesia, and for every additional minute in the operating room, there's an increased risk of complications to the patient.
Right.
And so again, I was like, there has to be a better way.
Are you sick of dieting and counting calories and endless workout routines? What if I told you that by losing weight, you're actually ridding your body of a key resource to potentially better your health? Our guest today believes our excess and unwanted body fat can transform your appearance, boost your confidence, and heal your body in an all-new way. This doctor considers your body fat to be liquid gold, and I tend to agree, using it for regenerative therapy, skin health, and aesthetics. Today, we have the pleasure of sitting down with a surgeon scientist and founder of Sayenza Biosciences, Dr. Derek Banyard, to discuss why he believes his new revolutionary fat grafting technology is the future of regenerative medicine. It's great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Of course. Listen, I know how busy you are, and I really appreciate you taking the time out, but I do think that you've got some pretty amazing technology. And, I can't wait to see it unfold. But before we get into that, I kind of want to go into your background a little bit, because plastic surgery is your inception, your starting point. Kind of take me through how you started, where the transition was, how this even came to be, and we'll start from there.
Absolutely. So I'm an East Coaster. I grew up in Virginia, went to the University of Virginia. After that, I went to medical school at Meharry Medical College, which is one of the historically Black medical schools, and that one's in Nashville, Tennessee.
Love it.
While I was in Nashville, I ended up also getting a MBA at Vanderbilt, a dual degree. I was always interested in business, didn't quite know where business would slide in, but I knew it would arm me with some tools that would be useful down the road. After medical school, business school, I decided to go into the lab. I wanted to make myself a little bit more competitive, but also more well-rounded as a scientist. I was always interested in research and did research in undergrad. And so I actually ended up at the University of Maryland. So I was in the tissue engineering lab there for a few years. My wife, who's also a physician, she matched at University of Maryland, so it was a good fit.
Oh, amazing.
And so she did her training there, internal medicine, and then I went into the match, and I matched into general surgery.
Amazing.
And so general surgery brought me to California. So I actually started out at Loma Linda, spent a couple years doing my general surgery training, at which point I decided that I really wanted to pursue plastic surgery.
Sure.
And so I decided to go back to the lab to make my application a little bit more competitive. And that's when I landed in Southern California at UC Irvine, the Center for Tissue Engineering.
Amazing. Yeah, listen, and for all the viewers and listeners out there, you have to understand this is really cool, cutting edge stuff. And the very fact that you have this type of experience in it is kind of a big deal. I mean, look, we train in traditional medicine. There's so much more out there. And the very fact that you've kind of combined the two is absolutely amazing. When did you realize, so let's say now you're in this tissue engineering lab and you realized that your tissue of choice was going to be fat.
Yeah, so when I joined the Center for Tissue Engineering at UC Irvine, the lab was kind of in a rebirth. It had kind of gone dormant for several years, and a guy by the name of Dr. Alan Widrow, who's a South African plastic surgeon, had just transplanted to Southern California and took over the lab. And so he was looking for, what the primary core competency of the lab was going to be. At the same time, Patricia Zook, a scientist, a PhD at UCLA, had discovered that fat had stem cells analogous or similar to bone marrow stem cells. And she characterized and described the first techniques to harvest those stem cells from fat. She came down to the Center for Tissue Engineering lab and taught the lab how to harvest those stem cells. And at that point, it, in our view, was a no-brainer. Bone marrow stem cells have been around for decades,
Sure.
and they've never caught on as a widespread regenerative therapeutic because of the limited access the painful
Exactly.
access and the limited yield. And so it made sense that we would hang our hats on fat and stem cells as, our
Love that. I mean, listen, again, the way we always view it is it's kind of a 2-for-1. We're harvesting fat, which otherwise known as microliposuction can be large volume liposuction. The interesting part is now what we used to discard, we realize has so much potential value. And, in the days now of regenerative therapies, looking at birth products versus fat, the idea is that we can get some pretty powerful resources there. Now that we have this background a little bit, so we paint the picture, you've got a medical and business background. You head into the lab. This Professor Zook comes down, Dr. Zook comes down and, kind of enlightens everyone on the potential. And now all of a sudden there has to be the inception point wow, where you say, man, I can do something with this.
Yeah. So in 2013, a paper was published on nanofat. Nanofat is the term or the name it's a catch-all term at this point that was coined by doctors Patrick Tonard and Alex Verpaal. And they're Belgian-based regenerative surgeons, and they published this paper where they took fat and shuffled it between 2 syringes and then injected the resulting therapeutic for the correction of wrinkles a la Botox, but also to increase the quality of skin when there was blemishes, and we're using it all over the body and getting really amazing results. And I was a little surprised because there wasn't much analysis of what they were actually injecting.
Sure.
I mean, it was more of a clinical paper and less of a basic science paper.
So interesting, because I remember when they held their own conferences. I remember them speaking at multiple conferences, and I always gravitated towards Tonard because, he's a very slick guy and results were amazing. And he did something called the Max Lift, which was the minimal access cranial suspension. It was kind of like doing a full facelift with limited incisions. But he always talked about this nanofat placement and felt that because it was less clumpy like regular fat, and ultimately as he's going back and forth in between those 2 syringes became that liquid, less viscous, and you could place it into the tiniest little areas. And the results they were showing were pretty phenomenal. So now you say, all right, look, I like what you guys are doing, but how do you know that it's working?
Yeah. So during my time in the lab, I essentially developed a flow cytometry protocol, which is essentially a means of using antibodies and fluorescent markers so that you can, shoot lasers at different tissue and figure out what's in the tissue. And so I created this novel protocol and started characterizing nanofat. And my results resulted in a grant from the Plastic Surgery Foundation to really start to dig deep into this stuff.
Amazing.
And so, I spent several years just studying nanofat and ways to improve the process of essentially mechanically processing fat to enrich and ultimately activate the stem cells in fat.
Now, look, you did mention, you alluded that it's kind of a catch-all phrase, the nanofat, because we've heard of stromal vascular fraction and we've heard of all kinds of things in the days of platelet-rich plasma that became, that was king for a while. Then we realized that there's more to it. Now, when you started doing this analysis, what did you actually see?
The first thing that was most astonishing was there's not a whole lot of fat in nanofat, because during this mechanical processing technique, you're actually lysing a lot of the adipocytes. So as we age, our adipocytes get larger and larger and more fragile. And what we found is that the process of mechanical emulsification of fat actually selects out the fragile adipocytes, and what's left are the robust regenerative cells. There's mesenchymal stem cells, which are analogous to the bone marrow stem cells. There are endothelial progenitor cells, which help to form new blood vessels. There's macrophages, which are immune cells, and they can be both inflammatory and anti-inflammatory. And then there's also these stromal components, which is like the connective tissue or the extracellular matrix, which has its own growth factors and works synergistically with the cells in this nanofat.
Amazing. So I'm imagining that Sayenza Biosciences has now, in your mind, just formed. So now you're doing you do this flow cytometry protocol. You now are characterizing what's actually in there. What was the inception point where you said, I'm going to create something that will revolutionize medicine?
Well, if you watch Shark Tank, there's always that point of the pitch where they're like, there has to be a better way, right? And so one of my biggest frustrations with nanofat is that it's not standardized. The amount of force I use to create nanofat is different than the next person. My muscles aren't going to be nearly as big as yours. So, just by changing the amount of force, you were changing the characteristics of the resulting therapeutic. I thought we have to standardize this. And so because the term nanofat is a catch-all term, if 8 different surgeons are using 8 different techniques to create nanofat, are we truly comparing apples to apples? And so if we could standardize it, we can confidently say to patients, I know what I'm injecting every time because I've automated the process and taken the guesswork or the variability out of creating that nanofat.
So now when we look to standardize something, so obviously you're going through a whole host of different tests and things like that. First of all, where did Sayenza come into play? And what were the next steps in developing this type of technology?
Well, and my story, I didn't even actually get to the plastic surgery part, right? So I spent several years in the lab, probably did a PhD's worth of research prior to matching into plastic surgery, integrated plastic surgery residency at UC Irvine. So I was very fortunate to match at the institution where I was doing my research. And I spent 2 years in the plastic surgery department, and I would be in the operating room all the time. And I would see the bottleneck of fat processing in the operating room. There's several tools that are available for processing fat, and we'd be operating on a patient, and it'd be time to process the fat. And so the patient would be sitting on, they're on the operating table. The room is cold because we keep it at a certain temperature. The anesthesiologist is doing Sudoku. The nurses are, on their phone or picking out the next song on the playlist while we're on the back table processing fat.
Right.
And every minute in the operating room is valued at, most recently, $37 per minute.
Yep.
And so we're literally wasting time, anesthesia, and for every additional minute in the operating room, there's an increased risk of complications to the patient.
Right.
And so again, I was like, there has to be a better way. And I, had all this research in my back pocket that I decided boldly at that point that I was going to leave residency to pursue this venture. Wow.
That is true. There are, it was so hard for the last couple decades to standardize any of this. I mean, and plastic surgeons have been fat grafting forever, right? And we looked at, there were several studies, whether we should centrifuge and how long should we centrifuge and at what RPMs, or should we put it on the back table and just put it on Telfa and drain some of the oils associated with it and keep and preserve the fat. Each surgeon has their method of choice, we'll say. But you're right, it's not standardized. So obviously now you're looking at this and you're saying, okay, there's got to be a better way, and I'm going to show you how to do it.
Yeah. And so Sayenza is actually a mashup of 2 words. So I founded this company with Dr. Alan Widrow. He is, like I said, a retired plastic surgeon from South Africa. And the other co-founder is Jared Hahn, who's a biomedical engineer at UC Irvine in their Department of Biomedical Engineering. Dr. Widrow, being South African, I looked to some of his geographical roots for the inspiration, because it's really hard to name a company these days.
Definitely.
So instead of...
There's nothing left.
Yeah, there's nothing left. So you got to make up a word. And so actually I looked at a lot of South African dialects and took the words Sayenza, which means science, and Enza, which means to build. And I just mashed them together. So Sayenza.
Oh, amazing.
To build science.
Love that.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So now tell me about your technology. Where do you begin?
Yeah, sure. So liposuction is the number 1 procedure performed by plastic surgeons. And This is a recent development. A lot of that is driven by the demand for, say, a Brazilian butt lift.
Yep.
But also plastic surgeons are increasingly using fat for not only breast reconstruction, but breast augmentation.
Definitely.
As a platform technology, Sayenza wants to address every touch point of fat, whether it's harvesting, processing, and delivery. And we're starting with the processing aspect. And so I mentioned my co-founder, Jared Hahn. He is a biomedical engineer. His expertise is in tissue processing and tissue dissociation. And so he's developed a series of microfluidic chips. If you've ever heard the term lab on a chip, essentially he developed a microfluidic chip that would allow for the dissociation of like tumor tissue into single cells.
Wow.
And so what we did was we kind of repurposed some of his technology to try to maximize the shear force, which is needed to create, a nanofat equivalent, but also to increase the recovery of the cells after processing. And so we started out by 3D printing these chips that had essentially Lure connectors so that you could hook a syringe to it or tubing to it. And we began studying the effects. And prior to creating these chips, we published a paper in 2016 in Plastic and Reconstructive Surgery where we deconstructed nanofat essentially. And so we looked at the fluidic principles of nanofat, the shear forces, and characterized and described how, there's laminar flow and turbulence that all leads to this maximal force of tissue disruption and ultimately cell enrichment and activation. And so we created these chips based on these principles, and we began testing it with the idea that these labs on chip could eventually be integrated into a disposable cartridge. Wow. And so that was our first technology. We are currently working on, which is actually more difficult, the challenge of cleansing fat. So there's several technologies out there right now. Revolve by Allergan has been on the market for years. Viality is a recent entrant into the market. There's a lot of tools for large volume fat cleansing, but all of them are manual and limited in the volume that can be processed. And so right now we're tackling the challenge of the cleansing of the fat so that is also handled by our chip.
So now, do you use a particular solvent or, I know when we stimulate bone marrow and we have peripheral that you have to use, some type of citric acid or some type of, I guess, an additive that would be able to preserve those cells. Is that what's being done? Or is it simply a wash session? Tell me how the technology works.
Yeah, so no poloxamers, no additives, purely mechanical processing with cleansing with saline. And so if a surgeon wants to, say, for instance, add antibiotics to their wash, they can still add it to the saline bag before the device cleans the fat. But no, we've developed a series of proprietary algorithms and technologies. We have several patents pending that we are integrating into this chip. So, without telling our secrets, essentially there's a dynamic washing process that goes on within this chip or within this cartridge rather. And then it goes on to the next path, the next chip, where it's then processed for your nanofat equivalent.
So some type of shearing that allows the fragile cells to degrade, and you're basically left with all the good stuff, and then you dump whatever you don't need.
And our platform is unique in that it does both. It'll create fat for large volume fat grafting as well as a nanofat equivalent. But what truly sets our technology apart is it combines the large volume fat with the nanofat equivalent for a cell-assisted lipotransfer type of effect. And so cell-assisted lipotransfer was first, I believe, described by Yoshimura in Japan, and it's been championed by surgeons like Dr. Peter Rubin and others who have shown that when you extract stem cells from fat and add it back to fat for fat grafting purposes, you get a superior clinical...
higher yield.
Yeah, higher yield, higher retention, and the histology of the fat is just better. And so our device builds on this theory or this technique where it combines the micronized fat with the macro fat, if you will, the large volume fat, to create a superior fat graft product.
Interesting. Wow. Another surgeon that does a ton of that is Curry. It has the Brava device and things like that to help maximize the placement. But this is so unique. The interesting part, I guess, is How do you know? So let's say it's gone through this cartridge and it's done all the things it's supposed to do. How do you know that you have viable, effective nanofat?
Yeah.
I mean, there must be a measurement device that says, oh, by the way, we have this much.
Right. And so when surgeons are performing nanofat procedures or when they're using a Viality or a Revolve, they're not testing the fat in the operating room to make sure it's viable.
You're right.
All those tests have been done prior to those devices coming out.
The funny part is we go off cleanliness.
Yeah.
And how yellow or yellow the fat is. We think, oh my gosh, this is absolutely pure. But the interesting part, and same thing with Telfa, I will, on the back table for every facelift, I will literally put it on Telfa and kind of spoon it out, remove some of the oils, and then we place it in 1cc syringes. But there's no way for me to know, all right, this is good and this isn't. So there are patients that come back, there's minimal retention, where there's others that have amazing retention. How does your technology at least prove to you that you've got the best?
Right. So we are a science-first company. We published that paper that deconstructed nanofat several years ago, and then just last year we published our first device paper, which painstakingly goes through how our device enriches stem cells. So we get fat multiple times a week, every week that we test with our device. And so we're building a huge sample size of data demonstrating the efficacy and consistency of our device. We know that with our device, we get equal, if not higher, viability of cells compared to nanofat technique, but we also get a higher yield of cells. So using our device with the built-in filtration system actually yields a higher number of cells than if you were to do a traditional nanofat technique, whether you use a cube device or a twisty device that you bought from a certain company that you can autoclave.
Sure.
We know that our device consistently yields a higher number of cells with equivalent, if not better, viability. But in addition to that, on a regular basis, we test the cells for phenotype, meaning the identity of the cells. And so we know that we're getting a 3 to 4x increase in stem cell markers using our device.
Wow.
And then we've also done studies, which we're getting ready to publish, that demonstrate that using our device, genes are turned on. And so genes related to increased blood vessels, vascularity, immune modulation, so decreasing inflammation, and specifically genes related to wound healing are turned on just by using our device. And so, every week we're getting tissue, testing it with our device, and publishing, because if I'm not convinced as a scientist that this thing is making a difference, there's no way I would go out and try to sell it to other doctors.
Of course. First of all, is there the name to the machine?
Yeah, we're calling it the ARC, the Adipose Refinement Console. It's our first of series of devices we're going to
love it. And which procedures do you feel like this will be most beneficial to? I remember you were talking about not only nanofat, but also large volumes. Where would you see this fitting in plastic surgery?
Yeah, so we really are trying to build a device that every plastic surgeon will want to use. We want this device in every operating room in the country. And so our first device is geared towards large volume because we know that, the primary driver of adoption right now is those large volume procedures like Brazilian butt lift and breast augmentation. So the device we're launching with will have the capability of processing up to 3 liters of fat.
Wow.
And it'll do so fully automated. It'll generate about a liter of fat every 15 minutes. And it works continuously.
This is amazing. So for those of you that are watching and listening, 3 liters is a significant volume. So when we use some of the other systems like Viality and the others, they're smaller systems. And the difference is once you've filled that container, that's it. It's not like it's processed once. I can't refill it and try it again. It's a one and done sort of thing. So having that potential is phenomenal.
Yeah, you'd have to use like 3 Vialities to get to our volume. Revolve, I think, is about 350 cc's. So we're talking 10 times having to use the device. You can imagine the amount of time and manpower needed for that. And we know like 3 liters is kind of extreme, but we want to make sure that we can address or fulfill the needs of surgeons from small to large.
Yeah, definitely.
And so, our device will the average plastic surgeon probably doesn't need more than a liter of fat for any given procedure, and that's the standard use case for our device. Our device will produce both that large volume fat for fat grafting, whether it's a Brazilian butt lift or breast augmentation or breast reconstruction, but you can also use that fat for smaller indications like face. And then it also produces that nano fat equivalent so that you have all the fat you need. You have your large volume fat, you have your nano fat equivalent, and it all comes out of the same device, hands-free, no processing. Your scrub tech doesn't have to do anything. Your nurses don't have to do anything.
Amazing.
And it'll process as you're doing lipo.
It's so funny. It's so funny you say that about the scrub tech because, sometimes when Dr. Daniel Port does, let's say larger volumes with fat transfer to the breast or somewhere else or Brazilian, they dread having to process all that fat because not only does it take time, and then when you use the Viality machine or the device, it's like you're constantly, it's such a small amount that it doesn't help for some of those things. And so it is interesting. It sounds like great technology. I mean, beyond aesthetics, do you see any applications for this type of technology?
Absolutely. So, we're launching in the aesthetics market, not only because it's a large market, but it's cash-based, meaning the reimbursement is not really an issue. But we really see our hero indication in the pain ortho rehab space.
Interesting. So now injecting nerves, joints, things like that using this technology.
Yeah, so there are several players in this space. One of the largest is currently in a phase 3 clinical trial injecting joints with microfragmented fat, nanofat type fat, and they're seeing excellent results. They've already developed CPT codes to start to build that case for reimbursement.
Wow.
And once large insurance companies, Medicare and Medicaid, start reimbursing, you've got a massive market. And what they've shown is by injecting joints with kind of microfragmented fat, nanofat type fat, you're reducing the need for knee replacement or staving it off for several years. And nobody wants to get a joint replaced.
Yeah.
And so we see our device as being the go-to device for minimally invasive treatments for joint pain and rehab.
Phenomenal. When are you coming to market?
So we plan to come to market late next year, so 2025, potentially early 26, but we're really pushing for 25.
Amazing. And then that is, you're making it through the FDA process now, and so that's the time constraint.
Well, time constraint is that in our development. So we're still developing that fat washing component of the cartridge. We have several fully working prototypes in our lab, but now we're micronizing it into a commercially viable platform that can be scaled. We did have our first pre-submission meeting with the FDA, which is that process where you show the FDA what you're building, how you're building it, and how you plan to test it. And we've already gotten the green light that we're doing things the right way and to continue down the path we're going.
So exciting technology coming the end of next year, potentially sooner, starting off in aesthetics, and that's not even the hero indication, for pain, because that's such a larger market right there. What do you see in the near future and long term for both yourself and for Sayenza? Is this it? You're going to ride it and go? Or are you saying, oh, you know what? I may have another idea, or I may move forward here. It's interesting because I feel like as a surgeon scientist, once your brain starts moving and then it's hard to stop it.
Yeah. So I see several possible outcomes. When I walk the floors of the convention hall at the aesthetics meeting or plastic surgery the meeting, and I see the technology that these companies are putting forward, it's decades old or 20 years old technology. Nobody's really innovating in the space because obviously innovation is risky.
Costly.
Most large companies don't innovate by building, they innovate by acquiring. And so I see what we're building as the natural progression of things in terms of how you get a new technology into the space. But I totally think that 5 years from now, Sayenza could have that big booth in the middle of plastic surgery, the meeting,
right?
And be a massive company with our device in almost every OR or clinic across the country. And so, I do see that potential for this company. We have other ideas, and part of that is, obviously, I've listened to your other podcasts. We've talked about exosomes and these other off-the-shelf type of therapeutics. And I think that there is some applicability in terms of our device and generating a special kind of exosome that could be a whole nother market, a whole nother set of therapeutics. But also through entrepreneurship and being outside of clinical medicine, I do still practice clinical medicine half a day a week, doing like wound care and things like that. And I miss, the clinic space and having that one-on-one relationship with the patient and improving their lives. But also through entrepreneurship, you can impact
thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, definitely.
And one of the things I know is that almost every plastic surgeon has a genius idea, and they don't have the bandwidth to bring it to market. So one potential avenue I see myself after I launch this successful venture is to become an incubator, accelerator of sorts for plastic surgeons to help get their ideas to market.
Amazing, because you know the pathway, you know what it takes, where to go, how to, that's phenomenal. Because you're right. I mean, everybody is doing a procedure, and you're like, man, it would be so much easier if we did this. But to actually engineer it and move forward, we have our young clinical partner is coming up with an app that deals with, completely unrelated, but it's a billing app where it just simplifies things. Medicine is getting to the point where sometimes there's so much red tape that we have to find ways of making it simpler for us. Otherwise, we're going to see a dramatic decrease in the amount of people that want to be physicians. So that's amazing. I'm happy for you. I think, it sounds like amazing technology, and we can't wait to see it come to market. So I'm imagining we look at some of the initial sites. I hope that we are considered as one. And, we do a fair amount, obviously, of this procedure and the re-injecting part. So I think, it's a perfect fit.
I mentioned how Drs. Banyard and Verpaal invented this nanofat technique. Well, they were so convinced that the technology we're building, they joined our clinical advisory board.
Oh, amazing.
And, we have, in my opinion, a murderer's row of some of the top minds in plastic surgery, including the current president of ASPS, Dr. Stephen Williams. So we're building a team of thought leaders that are going to be unparalleled and make sure that the technology we're building addresses the pain point of the surgeons, but also creates the best possible therapeutics and outcomes for the patient.
Definitely. I mean, I listen, for those of you who don't know, Banyard and Verpaal are some of the biggest names in plastic surgery for, the procedures that they have coined and designed. And so I think you're right. You're stacked heavy. If you like this video, you're going to love this one.
Lipedema is a fat storage conditions categorized in that category that is very under-recognized around the world.